Hey everyone, Delve here. You can check out my channels here. Today we're going over what I'll call non-scaling types of damage in Dark Souls. As I've already covered, most ways of dealing damage in Dark Souls revolve around certain stats, such as strength and intelligence, the main exception being pyromancy. However, there are still some remaining ways of dealing damage, and they can be roughly lumped into the category of non-scaling, since they don't depend on any stats for the amount of damage that you deal. So we'll start with the upsides. The most obvious one is that you get more damage for less stat investment. This frees you up to increase your health and stamina, and you'll still do okay damage, while being extremely durable. The next advantage is the variety of weapons you have access to. Since non-scaling damage tends to revolve around certain weapon ascensions, this means you could hypothetically ascend any weapon of your choice as long as you meet the stat requirements. This means you can make really good use of a lot of weapons which would otherwise be suboptimal, such as weapons with bad stat scaling. You also gain access to solid ranged weapons in crossbows. These can't be manually aimed like regular bows, so they lack the same level of utility. However, these are still solid and maybe even underrated weapons, and can be handy for any character that can meet the stat requirements. Obviously, there are some downsides as well. The first one is that your damage is noticeably low, especially against the DLC bosses. This is because the elemental weapon ascensions without scaling have split damage, meaning they deal half physical damage and half elemental damage, meaning physical and elemental resistances are calculated for each damage type. What this means is that these weapons will simply deal less damage to enemies, especially enemies with high resistances. In practice, this means any boss with a high resistance to fire or lightning has to be made note of and prepared for, and it also means you'll deal noticeably low damage to both Calamite and Manus. The next downside is similar to stats like Faith, in that it encourages you to play the game in a sort of inorganic way. This is because certain weapon ascensions can be unlocked early, but this requires some foreknowledge to be able to pull off effectively. On the main, I think that non-scaling damage is actually surprisingly effective, and that it's a surprisingly good way to beat the game, arguably more efficient than utilizing any damage stats. Okay, on to the weapons. First thing to note is the light crossbow. This can be found in the Undead Burg, and it's a solid weapon in general, although it is outclassed by other crossbows. Highly recommend picking up this crossbow. I think crossbows in general are underrated in this game, and that they're highly versatile for lots of different types of characters. The next weapon we're talking about is the Drake Sword. This can be obtained by cutting off the Hellkite Wyvern's tail. The easiest way to do this is to snipe it off with a regular bow and arrow, which will require a dexterity of at least 12 to wield a short bow, and you'll want around 100 arrows. This will take several minutes to do, even if you have good aim, but eventually you'll obtain it. This is sort of the game's iconic non-scaling weapon, having nice low stat requirements with decent damage. Even against the game's final bosses, this weapon isn't bad, although upgrading it is expensive and a pain. Highly recommend this weapon, although I personally haven't used it that much. Now you might wonder about the remaining dragon weapons, most of which don't have stat scaling. The main issue with discussing these weapons is that the majority of them have very high strength requirements, which sort of defeats the purpose of using them as weapons with no scaling. That's not to say they're useless. The Dragon King Great Axe can be buffed with resins and spells, and the other Dragon Greatsword has an interesting ranged attack. But you're still looking at hitting a 34 strength minimum requirement to wield them, which is a little high if you plan to make use of non-scaling weapons. There's also a cool one that can be obtained by cutting off Calamite's tail, but that's quite difficult to obtain, as you need to both reach Calamite and then also manage to cut off his tail. Okay, next I'll talk about weapons in general. You of course have lots of great options, including basically any greatsword, axe, or halberd. If the weapon has weird mixed scaling, or bad scaling, it's probably a great candidate. The real question is whether or not it has good range, and a good moveset, and good base damage. As we go, I'll call out any weapons I use or recommend. One such example is the Reinforced Club, which can be bought from the Undead Merchant in the Undead Burg. Since it has great base damage, it's nice and light, and can stagger enemies fairly easily. Another one is the Halberd, which is the main weapon I personally recommend, and it can be found in the Undead Parish. I highly recommend this weapon. It has high range, deals surprisingly good poise damage, and has solid base damage, but it has weak scaling, and so is a great candidate for non-scaling Ascension. Another weapon is the Bastard Sword, which can be bought from Andre of Astora. This weapon is basically a claymore and is a solid candidate. Really, you can use just about any weapon you like, and the overall damage will be fine for the majority of the game, as long as you like the moveset. You will, however, want to upgrade it to at least +5. The next weapon is a heavy crossbow, which can be located in the depths near the Gaping Dragon boss arena. This is slightly heavier than the light crossbow, but is better in basically every other way. Again, I highly recommend crossbows. They're underrated and highly useful, and I think it's a solid option against Quelaag, for example. Okay, so a +5 weapon will get you decently far, but past Quelaag it's not really good enough. Your first option would be to get your weapon to +10, but the damage won't be particularly good if you aren't benefiting from stat scaling. Luckily, you have another option, but it's going to be a bit of work. Your other option is to ascend your weapon to fire, which will remove the weapon stat scaling, but will probably do more damage if you have low stats. This will require green titanite shards, and can be done by Blacksmith Vamos at the bottom of the catacombs. Getting down to the bottom of the catacombs can be quite difficult, but there are things we can do to make it much more enticing, since we can actually upgrade it even further. That's because we can obtain the Chaos Ember, which can be found past Quelaag in the Demon Ruins, and can actually be obtained before Anor Londo. First you have to kill Ceaseless Discharge, which can be either done conventionally, or it can be done with the easy kill method by running to the Black Gold set and then back to the arena entrance. Fire resistance can help you here immensely, and enough can be obtained by equipping the Black Gold set depending on how high your health is. If you have low health and need more fire resistance, the Flash Swap Pyromancy can help. The next step is to kill like 8 Taurus demons, which can be a pain, although they don't respawn. I highly recommend a +10 heavy crossbow here, which means returning to Andre at some point. Once the Taurus demons are dead, you should be able to obtain the Chaos Ember with just the Black Gold set and some investment in health, but if you need more fire resistance, Flash Sweat from Laurentius can be useful, and the Flamestone Plate Ring, which can be found at the top of Sen's Fortress. There's also a large Flame Ember nearby, but it's not as good as the Chaos Ember, and it's just as much of a pain to obtain in my opinion. Next we need Red Titanite chunks to upgrade it to Chaos, ideally as many as we can get our hands on. For starters, at least 2 can be obtained in the Great Hollow, as well as more can potentially be obtained from Crystal Lizards if you get lucky. These are a huge pain, but obtaining at least 1 of these chunks is a great idea, and this is because you need a total of 4 chunks to upgrade your weapons to +3 Chaos, and 3 more can be obtained in the Northern Undead Asylum. 2 of them drop from the Black Knights in the Undead Asylum, and the last one can be obtained by trading a Pyromancy Flame with Snuggly the Crow. Note that the Pyromancy Flame must not be upgraded. And after all of that, we still have to get to the bottom of the catacombs just to upgrade our weapon to +3 Chaos. And then we have to climb all the way out. The damage is good though, and it scales with humanity, meaning you'll get a nice extra bonus if you happen to have some humanity on you. It's up to you whether or not you want to put in that kind of work, but it will help immensely in Sen's Fortress and against the Ornstein and Smo fight. While you're here in the catacombs, another thing you can get your hands on down here is the Lucerne, which is an interesting halberd weapon, although I've never personally used it. Next is Anor Londo, and there's a few things to note here. The first thing is the Gargoyle's Halberd, which I'm fairly certain is a guaranteed drop from the Gargoyles here in Anor Londo. This is another solid halberd weapon, and it even comes with a nice bonus to bleed and poison resistance. Here in Anor Londo, you can also upgrade your weapons with the Lightning Ascension, which can be useful against enemies resistant to fire damage. There are, of course, enemies resistant to lightning as well, so having a Chaos weapon and a lightning weapon on hand is a good idea, and each of them uses a different upgrade material, so this is actually fairly easy to do. Okay, one last weapon to talk about is the Avalyn, which can be found in the Duke's Archives. It can be obtained with some difficulty by dropping off the platform above this bookshelf. The easiest way to do this is to move the stairs so that they are out of the way, and then quit out and reload the game while still on the stairs. It will then put you on the platform above the bookshelf in the perfect position to drop. This is an insanely powerful crossbow which fires a 3-bolt burst. It probably does the most damage out of any non-scaling weapon in the game, surprisingly, and has all the utility of a crossbow. I recommend bringing this weapon to a regular +15, as the ammunition is significantly cheaper than lightning ammunition. Even if you do go lightning, you will either lose damage or the damage increase will be negligible because of split damage. This Avalyn crossbow is my favorite weapon in the entire game, and again it does surprising damage at +15 even against bosses like Calamite and Manus. Assuming you are extremely physically durable, crossbows maybe are the way to beat the game deathless, and I can't recommend them enough even if the damage isn't as high as some other weapons. Okay, next up I think it's worth talking about armor. The main armor set that stands out to me is the Elite Knight set, which can be found in the Darkroot Garden. This is a nice set that gives you good resistances and isn't even that heavy. Another nice armor set you can get your hands on is the Stone Guardian set, which can be found in the Darkroot Garden. The nice thing about this set is it can't be upgraded, but it has really high defenses. In Anor Londo, there are 2 armor sets you can find. The first one is the Black Iron set, which is a little bit lighter than a lot of the heaviest armor sets, but it still provides good defenses. And lastly, we can't forget about Havel's armor. This is sort of the obvious big heavy armor set in the game, and it's of course a solid armor set. As for rings, the usual suspects apply here, namely Havel's ring and Ring of Favor and Protection to help you get the heaviest possible armors. You're also in a great position here to make use of Dark Woodgrain ring, assuming you're willing to go for a little bit of a lighter armor set. And you could also similarly make use of rings like Ring of Steel Protection and other elemental defense rings if you so wish. Your character build is more or less exactly as you'd imagine. Hit whatever stat requirements for your weapons. I recommend 16 strength for Eagle Shield and 14 dexterity for Avalon. The main stats you'll want to level are health and stamina, but the main question is whether or not you want to max one before the other. My opinion is that the best strategy is to level stamina enough so you can get medium roll with some armor equipped and your weapons, and then to level health. You might get a little tiny bit more mileage out of health if you're looking to obtain the Chaos Ember early. After health is at 40, you can go ahead and get stamina to 40 as well. From there, you can level resistance. You could look at maybe adding other weapons to your roster, stuff like that. And there's the guide for non-scaling weapons. In some ways, this was one of the most efficient runs of this game that I've ever done. And now I actually kind of recommend this strategy. It's pretty good. The main thing you'll want to do is make sure you get a good strong weapon with a great moveset. I can't recommend the halberd and crossbows enough. Thanks for watching.